Welcome to our ComAI lecture today with Simone Natale from University of Turin. I guess many of you know him because of his publications on AI. He's also one in the group who was very much engaged building up human-machine communication, interest group and this environment at ICA, and was, I think, one of the very first people who really started to write on what we call AI now from this perspective. Simone's latest book has the title, now I must look where, I forgot it to put it on my list. So what is the title of the book you're working on?
I don't have a title yet, but
So it's an ongoing project.
It's about one-to-one communication. That's maybe the title.
Okay, good. So you know more than I, or possibly that was the reason why I could not find it on my leaflet or my piece of paper. Simone Natale, he's also editor of Media, Culture and Society. So this might be of some interest for some of the people here in the room, but also for many, many years related to this journal. I think it goes back to your time when you've been at Loughborough University. Yeah. So this is how it started. I think the very special thing about Simone Natale, at least from my perspective, is that he not only addresses questions of AI from a qualitative point of view, but also in a very long-term perspective. And this says a lot about the background Simone has. So he's one of the media historians who really does do terrific work on AI. I think this will also part of his talk today, which reflects on power, geometries. This is a conversation we started with at Media, Culture and Society. So we are all very much looking forward to your talk. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you all for coming here and for the invitation. It's really always nice to be in Bremen. I was also a Zemke Fellow here a few years ago when I was preparing my first book on AI, so it's really great to be here again. And I start my presentation with an example. In 2023, just when discussions were growing about ChatGPT and AI, the Italian Privacy Protection Authority, which is called the Garante della Privacy, decided to block ChatGPT in Italy, pending investigation of how OpenAI complied with privacy laws. This decision was very controversial. It attracted a lot of discussion, and many in Italy and also elsewhere thought that the problem, as someone put it, was cultural, that there was some technophobic attitudes in Italy that had shaped this decision that seemed to go against what was being done in all other countries. This was the start, really, of the enthusiasm about large language model, about ChatGPT. However, the decision finally also inspired wider debates at the European and global level, and the same issues that Garante della Privacy was dealing with were then discussed and agreed upon at a European level regarding issues about privacy that were later tackled also in part by OpenAI itself. So this case is interesting because it shows the tension between global and local that is a part of all contemporary AI ecosystems. On the one side, AI is a global endeavor. We cannot understand AI if we do not place it, contextualize it within global flows of power, money, and people. On the other side, AI is also always situated in local context, as any act of communication is always situated in local context. So how can we make sense of these two apparently contrasting direction, AI as a global and AI as a local phenomenon. This was the question that we asked in a project that we called the Human-Machine Communication Cultures that I led at the University of Turin until a couple of years ago. To address this question, what we try to do is to bring together a number of great scholars from very different perspectives, also to try to think about AI from different parts of the world, including Europe, the United States, China, and Latin America. And we discussed some important issues and questions that had to do with contextualizing this global dimension of AI. One problem that we highlighted at the start of the project was that there was a need to consider, as said, both global and local trajectories. Another issue was the difficulty of tracing the multiplicity of relationship and divides between the global north and global south, but also between regional macro areas, different countries, and different communities and groups. So a multiplicity of directions and relationships. And another issue was that there was some interesting and important work being done from a comparative perspective, but we also felt that this had some problems. It tended to privilege natural differences over diverse movements and did not make sense of also the ways in which flows of technology and also of power actually circulated across different spaces. So to make sense of these questions and problems, we looked back at a concept proposed in the early 90s by a geographer, a cultural geographer, Doreen Massey, which was the concept of power geometries. And we used this to try to make sense of this tension between the global and local dimension of AI. So in this talk, I will start by looking first at this local context more in detail. Then I will consider the global dimension, and finally I will introduce the power geometries, and I will see how these actually entailed elements of continuity, but also elements of changes with their earlier media history. So to start, so as said, AI is always situated in specific cultures. Maybe the best way to show this is going back to one of the earliest interventions on AI. Actually, this was made before artificial intelligence was even proposed as a concept. This was the famous paper by Alan Turing, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where Turing proposed this Turing test, the imitation game, he called it at the time. He started this paper by asking the questions if machines can think. But then, in the next lines of the paper, in a quite unusual way for a scientific paper, he proceeded to dismiss the very question he had started with. He reasoned that it didn't make sense to ask if machine can think because we won't find an agreement on what thinking means. And so he proposed to substitute this question with another question, with another thing, a test actually, or a game as he put it. And this was what he had in mind, the so-called Turing test, where we have an interrogator having a conversation with something or someone. The interrogator, here represented with the letter C, does not know if he or she is talking with a machine or a human. Just on the ground, the conversation he or she is having, they have to decide if it is a computer or a human. If the computer convinces the interrogator that it is actually a human, then it will pass the test. So the Turing test has been discussed endlessly, and it is one actually of the more discussed and cited papers in the history of the field of AI. Some pointed to the fact that it provides a definition of intelligence based on verbal behavior, and others reason on the fact that it gave a quite pragmatic target for researchers in this early stage of computing history and AI history. But maybe the real message of the Turing test is a different one, is that we don't have to focus so much, or at least not only, on the machine, but we have to focus also, and maybe especially, on the people who enter in interaction with this machine. And in fact, if we look again at this graph that represents the Turing test, we see that there are quite a lot of humans for a test about machines. And in fact, by dismissing this question if machines can think, Turing rejected the possibility to define AI in absolute terms, and instead he proposed to define it in terms of how it looked for humans. It were humans that projected intelligence onto the machine. And this reminds us of the need to situate and contextualize AI always in specific cultural, social, linguistic, political, and so on context. Something that has in itself its own difficulties because, as Raymond Williams pointed out, any definition of culture should be in fact, quote, in the plural, the specific and variable cultures of different nations and periods, but also the specific and variable cultures and social cultures of social and economic groups within a nation. So the implication of looking at AI and culture is also that we don't have one AI, but we have a plurality of AI cultures. And let us look at some example of this, so of how this cultural dimension is important. First point, generative AI is seen maybe in the singular form, is always discussed in the singular form, but actually is prepared for the public through a range of very different decisions and perspectives that are always culturally informed. Think, for instance, of the Californian culture that shaped the Silicon Valley and a lot of work in the area. For instance, also discussed by Andreas and other researchers here in Bremen with research on pioneer communities. And OpenAI is a good example of how this vision about general artificial intelligence and strong AI shaped also this direction of this company that has been so influential in the last few years. And think of, for instance, other culturally situated models in China and how the fact that they are situated in this specific context informs the conversation that actually emerge when interacting with these models, as for instance can be shown by just trying to discuss controversial topics with different models situated in different contexts. Second point, also the data that train AI is culturally situated. We know that large language models and AI models are trained through large masses of data. And we also know that all human-generated data are always culturally specific, even when their use is not, because the idea of large language models basically emerged as the idea of just trying to grow the number, the masses of data used to train, which actually doesn't usually convert in much specificity in terms of cultural sensitivity and choices, of course, because it was a lot of data that was meaningful for its quality, but mainly for its quantity. But this should not let us forget that actually the human-generated data is culturally specific, and the importance, for instance, of data that is produced in specific parts of the world also impacts how these models work and behave. And another example is the role of language, and we see here, for instance, the importance of English as the main language that is used to train large language model and other models. And we shall not forget how this impacts on the behavior and the situatedness of these models, despite their global use. And the third point is the fact that when we discuss about AI, we usually focus a lot on this training with a lot of data. In technical terms, it's called usually, especially the pre-training phase. But actually, there are also other phases that shape how this technology acts. And these include fine-tuning and customization practices that happen at local level, and they have a lot of impact on applications of these models, basically because these models are very generic in scope. So to be actually useful, they have to be prepared for specificity, because if not, they would be of difficult use. Example of this is also customization options that platforms such as ChatGPT offer, that you can create your own GPTs. So this is an example of how you situate. You start from a model that is globally, so to say, situated, although it's also culturally situated, as said before. And then you develop something on top of it. And examples include also institutions that take large language models such as GPT or Gemini and convert it in other things. For instance, a foundation in Turin, my hometown, created a chatbot and an avatar of the first Italian president of the Italian Republic, Luigi Einaudi. An idea that might be good or not, but certainly was very much about experimenting with all these potential uses at local level. And this about the local dimension, but as we will see, the global dimension is at least as important to understand AI. So, and we can make, again, some examples of this, and we can make some points to show how this is true. One first thing is the geopolitics, that actually shapes global flows of technology and applications. These include geopolitics of mineral resources, geopolitics of technologies such as hardware, and also of data that are a commodity of value that also are exchanged and extracted with geopolitical implications. The second point about the global dimension of generative AI is, of course, that AI is embedded and framed within a long history in which inequalities and colonialism still plays an important role. And we see this also in the distribution of power across, both in terms of technology and also in terms of governance of these technologies. And a third example is about labor. And here we see that, of course, so technologies and devices that are designed in some places and built in other places, but also, quite interestingly, the human labor that is appropriated by AI companies to perform duties such as reinforcement learning. Many reports have shown how low-waged work has been used by companies to perform these duties. So in a context that where distribution and inequality of wages played a role in these differences of power. So these examples and these points show what I pointed to at the start, this coexistence of the global and local dimension that are both very important to be considered. But how can we bring them together and try to make sense of them through one approach, or at least through a number of potential approaches? And here comes the notion of power geometries, which was introduced by Doreen Massey, as said in 1991, the first paper that mentioned this. And Massey defines the power geometries by pointing to the fact that places, Massey was a geographer, so she was interested in space and place. The places are not merely geographic coordinates, but they are, as she put it, articulating moments in networks of social relations and understandings. Again, she argued that different social groups have distinct relationship to this anyway differentiated mobility. Some are more in charge of it than others. Some initiate flows and movements, others don't. Some are more on the receiving end of it than others. Some are effectively imprisoned by it. So we have place that is shaped by networks of social relations and understanding, and people and organizations and groups that inhabit these networks, but through very different dynamics. As said, some on the receiving end, some imprisoned by it, and some instead in a role of initiator. Massey used the example of Kilburn, which is a neighborhood in London she was familiar with, as an example of how this makes sense in any kind of context, but especially one would say in a neighborhood such as this. She pointed out that Kilburn, while Kilburn may have a character of its own, it is absolutely not a seamless, coherent identity, a single sense of place which everybody shares. It could hardly be less so. People's roots through the place, their favorite homes within it, the connection they make physically or by phone or post or in memory and imagination between here and the rest of the world vary enormously. So a lot of networks and connection, and a lot of a space that in a place that meant different things for different people that navigated these networks. And second, she argued, it is or ought to be impossible even to begin thinking about Kilburn High Road without bringing into play half the world and a considerable amount of British imperialist history. Imagining it that way provokes in you, or at least in me, a really global sense of place. So Kilburn, although it is a local context, it is shaped by these global histories that reverberated in its present reality. Massey gave particular emphasis on power. She thought that to understand these networks and these geometries, we had to place power center stage. And she meant this in different ways. First, power geometries are the expression of power dynamics, so they are shaped by power. And power configure the positions occupied by different actors in the social order within power geometries. But at the same time, power geometry shape the possibilities of these actors to express their agency, their ways of life, their knowledge, their cultural practices, and their imaginary. So power geometry at the same time shapes the possibility of also administering, creating, and using power. Let us make some example of how this can be seen. Again, let's think about the example of AI and labor. I already mentioned about subcontracted workers in the global south. here we have people employed on a small fraction of the wage that would need to be paid to similar workers in the global north. So the global flows of commerce and commodities make it viable to employ these in these areas. Their experiences are shaped, so their local experiences are shaped by private companies, public institutions, financial markets, users, bodies of data located in different parts of the world. But interestingly, they also, their cultural situatedness also changes even the very technology. And for instance, Hearn has shown that at some point, because of course these models always change, at some point OpenAI, ChatGPT, used the words that reflected English usage in specific parts of the world where reinforcement learning was happening. How does reinforcement learning works? Basically, it is again a way to something that happened after the training, the pre-training, the training with so these large amounts of data. And here, basically, these workers give very specific feedback to different behaviors and outputs of the model. And this, if done consistently on a very quantity of a lot of feedback, so a lot of workers and hours of work and so on, it can shape the behavior of the model in the direction that it is desired by those developing this model. Another example is data flows. Here we see data used to train AI models that are, of course, always situated, but at the same time, it becomes impossible to track down specific responses of the AI models to culturally situated sources, because basically large language models are opaque, and we don't know how all these amounts of data and training is organized the models themselves. And the extent to which we don't know is that now approaches to trying to understand how large language models work treat large language model as a natural phenomenon, because large language models are not created by programmers who give rules. So the only way to understand how they work is to study them from outside, treating them as a natural phenomenon. This is the methodology that actually researchers, for instance at Anthropic, applied to study large language model. And this is how this situatedness is present, because it informs the data, the outcomes and the behavior of the system, but at the same time, it is in a sense lost or difficult to trace. And again, global inequalities. On the one side, we have disparity in technology, with China and the US leading AI models development. We have disparity in resources, with investment concentrated in different regions. And also we have disparity in regulation, global north shaping of AI, discussion of AI ethics, as well as practical regulatory frameworks, as for instance, research by Vincent Obbia has shown how African countries are on the receiving end of ethical discussions and governance, rather than in a different position. So this is the concept of power geometries and why it can be useful to understand today AI. But it is also important to place this in a longer historical trajectory, and especially because actually the concept itself originated in a period where AI wasn't on the table, and although of course it was AI is a long history, but it wasn't what was discussed at the time. What was discussed was instead geometries that were being shaped by the press, by television, and later on we could see, and some have also shown, how power geometry remained so relevant for flows in digital media platforms that also circulate within local and global context. So we see certainly elements of continuity. And this continuity is also part of the very origins of these models and of AI, because generative AI has been built quite literally of communication. It could not have existed if not without the wide-scale creation, collection, and exchange of data locally and globally. Basically, the existence of the web and the communication that happened in it made it possible to concentrate all these amounts of data that made it thinkable for researchers, developers, and companies at a certain point to try just to enlarge the mass of data used to train these models to degrees that were unprecedented. So this is, of course, the element of continuity, but at the same time, there is an element of change that we have to consider. And in this sense, of course, the issue is related to agency. AI redraws power geometries as a technology, as a mediator, but it also takes up the role of the communicator. It takes up a position and a role in the construction of power geometries that previously was not the case for early media and platform forms. And we see that the consequences are multiple forms of agency being organized and at the same time dispersed across time, space, and place, involving machines, humans, institutions, governments, users, and developers, and making it hard even to recognize and identify the different forms of agency and differentiate them from one another. And something that we also can see is also the relevance of communication that actually involve only machines that constitute so the majority of communication that actually happens on the internet and involves the very importance of power geometries that do not involve human actors. By the way, also as data become more and more precious and expensive, synthetic data are used increasingly also to train AI models underlying this direction. So, in conclusions, so the concept of power geometries that we used in this project, we activated in this project, helped us to make sense of this tension between global and local in AI. Power geometries can be seen as a pathway that makes sense of the fluidity of AI, the fact that AI moves across a global and local context, and that AI, in a way, its data, its technology, its implication have to be traced across multiple directions and networks at local and global context. Second important thing is the emphasis on power that is shaping each actor's position, and this is another element that the power geometry concept really helps us to locate and to focus on. And another interesting thing is that actually Sharma and other researchers have also called for the importance of consider not just geometries, power geometries across space, but also across time, talking, for instance, about power chronographies. And this, we can see this how existing inequalities, existing circulations and trajectories of power continue to inform present situations and dynamics. And finally, so we see that AI ethics also becomes a cultural issue and a global endeavor. Very often we talk about AI ethics in the singular form, again, as AI is often discussed in a singular form, but we have to understand that actually there is a plurality of ethical approaches, but at the same time, AI ethics remains a global endeavor. So the two things are not opposed, but have to be combined to understand. And a good example of how this this can happen is the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, where we see the two dynamics being staged in the context of country-to-country discussions and policymakers. So what are the practical implications of thinking about this idea for also our ways to look and also to think about AI in our everyday context and in life? Well, we can say that very often these global flows of power make AI appear beyond control. And of course, this is the best example of this is the fact that only countries such as the US and China seem able to produce models that are so expensive, that require so many investment that they cannot be rivaled anywhere else. However, AI geometry of power are very complex and multifaceted, and spaces of agency emerge across local contexts in ethics and regulation efforts, in the customization and application of new models, so these fine-tuning, customization practices that are often overlooked but are very important in shaping the implications and impact of AI, and interpretation and appropriation by users and local communities. So the key challenge is navigating geometries of power across the local and the global. And the key challenge is also to remind us that for all these global flows of power, the importance of cultural and situated agency remains as high as it has ever been. Thank you very much for your attention.